I thought I was marrying the man of my dreams. Instead, I traded my freedom for a billionaire's obsession. I'm an Omega trapped in a high-tech fortress, forced to breathe the ultimate heir. What you're about to hear isn't a fairy tale. It's my desperate fight for survival. My name is Emma Grace. 3 years ago, I was just a quiet art restorer, working in a cramped, dusty studio in London's Soho district. I lived paycheck to paycheck, content with the scent of oil paints and old canvas. I was an unregistered Omega, a dangerous way to live in a world where biology often dictates your social standing. But I took suppressants to fly under the radar. I didn't want to be claimed. I didn't want to be owned. Then came Daniel Harrington. Daniel was the CEO of Harrington Global, an alpha whose reputation for ruthlessness in the tech and pharmaceutical industries was legendary. He walked into my studio on a rainy Tuesday looking for someone to restore a 19th century portrait of his great-grandmother. The moment he stepped through the door, the air in the room grew heavy. Even through my suppressants, his scent-sharp cedar wood and crackling ozone hit the back of my throat like a physical force. He didn't just look at the painting. He looked at me. His gaze felt like a predator evaluating a particularly interesting prey. Our courtship was a whirlwind that left me breathless and entirely off balance. Daniel was charming, attentive, and overwhelmingly protective. He paid off my student loans anonymously. He moved me out of my flat and into a penthouse overlooking the Thames. When he proposed under the starlight on his private yacht off the Amalfi Coast, I said yes. I thought his intense protectiveness was just his alpha nature. I mistook his control for devotion. I was so incredibly naive. The nightmare began the day after our wedding. We didn't go on a honeymoon. Instead, Daniel flew us directly to his ancestral home, a sprawling, isolated compound built into the cliffs of Cornwall, completely surrounded by high stone walls and a state-of-the-art security grid. The Harrington estate wasn't a home, it was a fortress. "You are the Harrington now, Emma," Daniel told me on our first night there, his large hands resting heavy on my shoulders as we stood looking out over the crashing waves. "You are the most precious thing in my empire. Out there, the world is dangerous. In here, you are safe, and in here, you will give me a son." The next morning, the suppressants I had relied on for years were gone from my medicine cabinet. In their place were prenatal vitamins, hormone regulators, and a strict, heavily monitored dietary schedule. My life was no longer my own. I was stripped of my phone and given a secure tablet that only connected to an internal network. The staff, mostly betas who kept their eyes firmly glued to the floor, were instructed never to speak to me unless spoken to. My only regular human contact aside from Daniel was Dr. Alistair Reed, the private physician on the Harrington payroll. Dr. Reed was a cold, clinical beta who visited my quarters every single morning to draw my blood, monitor my hormone levels, and track my ovulation cycles. He never smiled. He treated me less like a patient and more like a multi-million-dollar racehorse. "Your estrogen levels are peaking, Mr. Harrington, Doctor," Reed announced one morning, packing his syringes into his sleek leather bag. "The alpha will be joining you in your chambers at exactly 8 p.m. tonight. You are instructed to eat only the light broth prepared by the kitchen to ensure maximum fertility." I was a toy, a vessel. Whenever my heat approached, Daniel would arrive. The intimacy we shared wasn't born of love. It was a calculated biological transaction. Daniel would release his heavy, dominating pheromones, purposefully pushing me into a state of submissive omega haze, so that I couldn't resist him. My body betrayed my mind, melting under his touch while my soul screamed in violation. Afterward, he wouldn't stay to hold me. He would simply check his watch, log the time on his phone, and leave me shaking in the massive, cold California king bed. "You carry the Harrington legacy, Emma. he would whisper, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror before leaving. You must remain pristine, no stress. No negative thoughts, only perfection. But perfection was impossible, and the psychological toll of the isolation began to fracture my sanity. I wasn't allowed outside without a security detail. I wasn't allowed to read the news. My wedding band, a heavy piece of platinum, had a biometric tracker embedded in it. I found out the hard way when I tried to take it off in the bath. Within 60 seconds, 2 armed guards kicked down the bathroom door, followed by a furious Daniel who pinned me against the cold tiles, his eyes flashing red with alpha rage. Never, he growled, his scent turning to burnt ash and suffocating me. Never attempt to remove my claim on you again. That was the day I realized I wasn't just a husband. I was an incubator locked in a golden cage, and Daniel would never, ever let me go. 6 months into my captivity, the isolation became unbearable. The daily injections, the scheduled breeding sessions, the constant monitoring it was breaking me down into an empty shell. I desperately needed an ally. I found one in the most unlikely of places, Martha Higgins, the head housekeeper. Martha was an older beta woman who had worked for the Harrington family for decades. She kept her distance at first, strictly adhering to Daniel's rules, but she couldn't completely hide the pity in her eyes when she saw the fresh bruises on my wrists after a particularly aggressive heat cycle. One afternoon, while Daniel was in London for a board meeting, Martha brought my lunch tray. Instead of leaving immediately, she hesitated by the door. She looked around the massive, opulent room, then hurried over to my side and slipped a small, folded piece of paper under my napkin. This is the West Wing. The door with the keypad. The code is a 4-wait-eat. Look at the files. She left without a word. My heart hammered in my chest. The West Wing was strictly forbidden to me. Daniel had claimed it was undergoing structural renovations and was unsafe, but I had never seen a single construction worker enter the property. That night, waiting until the midnight guard rotation, I slipped out of my suite. The sprawling corridors of the Harrington estate were deathly quiet, save for the ticking of grandfather clocks and the distant roar of the ocean against the cliffs. I crept past the security cameras, memorizing their blind spots, a skill I had spent the last 6 months perfecting out of sheer boredom. I reached the heavy oak door at the end of the West Wing. The digital keypad glowed an eerie red in the darkness. My hands shook as I punched in the numbers. 0418. With a soft click, the lock disengaged. I pushed the door open, expecting to see a storage room or an office. Instead, I stepped into a state-of-the-art medical laboratory. The room was sterile and blindingly white, filled with centrifuges, genetic sequencing machines, and rows of lot filing cabinets. It looked like a hidden wing of the Wellington Clinic, entirely out of place in a 19th century manner. I rushed to the central desk, turning on the computer monitor. It required a password, but the top drawer of the desk was unlocked. Inside were physical medical files. I began pulling them out, my breath catching in my throat as I read the names. They weren't my files. The first file belonged to an Omega named Nathaniel Cross. I flipped through the pages, my horror growing with every clinical note. Nathaniel hadn't just been Daniel's employee, he had been my predecessor. The media had reported years ago that Daniel had a brief engagement that ended amicably when his partner moved to America. The file told a drastically different, deeply sinister story. Nathaniel had been pregnant. The ultrasound printouts were right there, clipped to the second page. But further down, I found genetic screening reports ordered by Dr. P. Alistair Reed. The fetus carried a recessive gene for a mild, easily manageable autoimmune condition. Subject's genetic contribution is flawed. Fetus does not meet Harrington lineage standards. Dr. Reed's handwriting noted at the bottom of the page. The next page was an operative report. Daniel hadn't just ended the engagement. When Nathaniel refused to terminate the pregnancy, Daniel had him forcefully sedated. They performed the procedure against his will. Afterward, Nathaniel suffered a complete psychological breakdown. The final document in the folder was a transfer sheet to St. Jude's private sanatorium in Switzerland, heavily funded by Harrington Global. Nathaniel was locked away in a psychiatric ward to keep Daniel's dark secret safe. I dropped the file, bile rising in my throat. I wasn't Daniel's first attempt at an heir. I was just the next test subject in his twisted pursuit of genetic perfection. Frantically, I searched the drawer for my own name. I found it in a thick red folder at the very back. I tore it open. Inside were my weekly blood test results. My eyes scanned the numbers, and the world tilted on its axis. According to the chart dated 3 weeks ago, my HCG levels were elevated. I was pregnant, but Dr. Reed had looked me dead in the eye just yesterday and told me my cycle was resetting and that I had failed to conceive. Why would they lie to me? I flipped to the next page and saw the order forms. Dr. Reed had drawn extra amniotic fluid under the guise of routine blood work. They were currently running a full genetic sequence on my unborn child. Daniel was waiting for the results. He was waiting to see if my baby was perfect enough to keep. If it wasn't, I knew exactly what would happen. They would drug me, dispose of my child, and tell me I had suffered a tragic natural miscarriage. "You shouldn't be in here, Emma." The voice sent a paralyzing shock of ice straight through my veins. I spun around, standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim hallway light, was Daniel. He wasn't supposed to be back from London until tomorrow. His tailored suit was impeccable, but his eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. The oppressive, terrifying weight of his alpha pheromones flooded the small laboratory, so thick and commanding that my knees buckled, forcing me to grip the edge of the desk just to stay standing. Daniel stepped into the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, sealing us inside. "I gave you everything," Daniel whispered, his voice dangerously soft as he walked slowly toward me, his eyes dropping to the red folder trembling in my hands. "I built you a paradise, and yet, like a disobedient pet, you go digging in the dirt." The silence in the laboratory was deafening. The only sound was the frantic, erratic thumping of my own heart. Daniel stood between me and the only exit, his massive frame blocking the light from the corridor. The air grew thick and heavy with his scent, a suffocating wave of burnt cedar and freezing ozone that commanded my biology to submit, to drop to my knees and bare my neck. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper, using the sharp pain to anchor my mind against the biological haze of his alpha pheromones. "Give me the file, Emma," Daniel said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The quiet menace in his tone was far more terrifying than any shout. "Is it true?" I choked out, clutching the red folder to my chest like a shield. Are you going to do to me what you did to Nathaniel?" Daniel sighed, a sound of profound disappointment, as if he were reprimanding a toddler who had broken a favorite vase. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. Before I could react, his hand shot out, his long fingers wrapping around my throat. He didn't squeeze hard enough to cut off my airway, but the grip was absolute. He easily pried the folder from my trembling hands with his free hand. "Nathaniel was defective," Daniel whispered, leaning in so close that his lips brushed the shell of my ear. "He was weak. He allowed his emotions to compromise the integrity of the Harrington line. I thought you were better, my sweet Omega. But look at you now. Your heart rate is elevated. Your cortisol levels are spiking. You're poisoning my child with your panic." He released my throat and grabbed my upper arm, dragging me out of the laboratory. I fought, digging my heels into the pristine carpet, but his alpha strength was insurmountable. I wasn't returned to my luxurious penthouse suite. Instead, Daniel dragged me to the sub-basement of the estate, into a windowless, soundproof room designed entirely in sterile, padded white. It looked exactly like the cell they had locked Nathaniel in. The door hissed shut behind me, locking with a heavy magnetic thud. I was completely trapped. For 3 days, the only person I saw was Dr. Alistair Reed. He came twice a day to take my vitals and administer an IV drip of what he claimed were calming nutrients. I refused to speak to him. I refused to eat the bland, nutrient-dense paste they slid through a slot in the door. I sat in the corner of the room, my arms wrapped protectively around my still flat stomach, praying to a god I wasn't sure was listening. On the 4th evening, the heavy magnetic door clicked open, and both Daniel and Dr. Reed stepped inside. Daniel looked immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, but his eyes were completely devoid of their usual possessive warmth. He looked at me the way one might look at a faulty piece of machinery. Dr. Reed cleared his throat, opening a digital tablet. The genetic sequencing is complete, Mr. Harrington. As we suspected from the initial amniotic draw, there is an anomaly. My blood ran completely cold. No, I whispered. Read it, Daniel ordered sharply, his jaw ticking. The fetus possesses a recessive genetic mutation on the 11th chromosome, Dr. Reed stated, his voice devoid of any human empathy. It indicates a 60% probability of developing severe myopia by the age of 7, and a 20% chance of a mild, non-lethal heart murmur. I stared at them, my mind struggling to process the absurdity of the words. Myopia? You mean bad eyesight, a heart murmur? That's nothing. That's normal human biology. A Harrington does not wear glasses, Emma, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. A Harrington does not have a weak heart. My empire requires a successor capable of absolute physical and intellectual dominance. I will not leave my legacy to a flawed creature. He's a baby. I screamed, scrambling to my feet, the maternal instinct of my Omega biology overriding my terror. He's our child, Daniel. He is a failed prototype, Daniel corrected coldly. He turned to the doctor. Schedule the procedure for tomorrow morning. Sedate him heavily tonight. I don't want him thrashing and causing any internal scarring. We will need his womb functional for the next attempt. Understood, sir, Dr. Reed replied, pulling a syringe from his pocket. No, please, Daniel. You can't. I threw myself forward, grabbing the lapels of Daniel's expensive jacket. I'll leave. I'll go away. I'll sign a non-disclosure agreement. I'll never tell anyone he's yours. Just let me keep him. Daniel looked down at me, prying my hands off his chest with effortless strength. You belong to me, Emma. You will stay here. And we will try again until you get it right. He shoved me backward onto the mattress. Before I could recover, Dr. Reed was on me, pinning my arm down. I felt the sharp pinch of the needle sliding into my vein. The sedative acted terrifying me fast. Within seconds, my limbs felt like lead, and the stark, white walls of the room began to blur and spin. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Daniel walking out of the room, not even bothering to look back. When I woke, the room was dimly lit. My head pounded with a vicious chemical hangover. I tried to move, but my muscles were painfully sluggish. I glanced at the digital clock embedded in the wall. 3:14 a.m. The procedure was scheduled for 6. I had less than 3 hours before they murdered my baby. I dragged myself to the door, pounding my fists against the heavy steel until my knuckles bled, but no sound escaped the soundproof walls. I slid down to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, burying my face in my hands. It was over. I had failed. Then a faint scratching sound came from the other side of the door. The magnetic lock disengaged with a soft thud. The heavy door cracked open just an inch. "Emma," a breathless, trembling whisper came from the darkness of the hallway. It was Martha. I pushed the door open, practically falling into the corridor. The older housekeeper caught me, pressing a finger to her lips. She was wearing her thick winter coat, and in her trembling hands she held a heavy iron fireplace poker. "Martha, what are you doing?" I choked out, my voice raspy. "If Daniel catches you, he won't," she said, her eyes fierce and wet with tears. "I disabled the cameras in the sub-basement. We have exactly 4 minutes before the security grid reboots, and the night shift notices the blackout." She grabbed my hand and pulled me down the hallway. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, stumbling over my own drug-heavy feet. Martha didn't look back, but her voice cracked as she answered. "Because Nathaniel Cross was my nephew. Daniel told me he sent him to a luxury retreat. I didn't know the truth until I saw the files you left pulled out on the desk. He destroyed my boy, Emma. I will burn in hell before I let that monster do it to you, too." The estate was a labyrinth of shadows and moonlight. Martha moved with the desperate speed of a woman with nothing left to lose, dragging me up the servant stairwells, bypassing the main halls entirely. My body was still fighting the heavy sedatives, every step feeling like I was moving through deep water, but the adrenaline and the primal need to protect my unborn child kept my legs moving. The extraction point is the old smuggler's cove at the base of the western cliffs, Martha whispered as we reached the back kitchen entrance. "My brother Nathaniel's father has a fishing boat waiting there. He's been circling the waters for 3 hours. You're coming with me, right?" I asked, gripping her arm tightly. Martha offered a sad, deeply resigned smile. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive. "I copied everything from the lab's mainframe, Dr. Reed's notes, the illegal genetic testing, the hush money transfers to the Swiss clinic. Take this. Give it to the press." "Martha, please. I have to buy you time," she interrupted, pushing the heavy iron back door open. The freezing, salty wind of the Cornish coast hit me like a physical blow, instantly clearing the last of the drug-induced fog from my mind. "Run, Emma. Don't look back." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, but a blaring, digitized siren suddenly ripped through the silent night. The security grid had rebooted. Red emergency lights bathed the courtyard in a demonic glow. "Go." Martha shoved me out into the driving rain, slamming the door shut behind me. Through the small reinforced glass window, I saw her wedge the heavy iron fireplace poker through the door handles, locking the guards inside the kitchen wing. I ran. The rain was a torrential downpour, turning the manicured lawns into slick, treacherous mud. I slipped and stumbled, my bare feet bleeding as I hit the gravel path that led toward the cliffside. The roar of the ocean grew louder, masking the sounds of shouting guards behind me. I reached the wrought iron gate that separated the gardens from the sheer drop to the ocean. The lock was rusted, an antique relic that Daniel hadn't bothered to upgrade because no one in their right mind would attempt the deadly descent in the dark. I climbed the slick metal, throwing myself over the top and landing hard in the wet heather on the other side. "Emma," the voice boomed through the storm, carrying an alpha command so powerful it made my knees buckle and hit the muddy ground. I scrambled to turn around. Standing on the other side of the iron gate, completely unfazed by the freezing rain, was Daniel. His eyes were wide, unhinged, and glowing with an animalistic fury. He didn't look like a billionaire CEO anymore. He looked like a predator whose prey had dared to bite back. He didn't bother climbing the gate. He drew a heavy, matte black handgun from his coat and shot the rusted lock twice. The iron screamed as he kicked the gate open, stepping onto the cliffside. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Daniel roared over the wind, stalking slowly toward me. The scent of his rage was toxic, burning the inside of my nose. "You carry my property. You are mine." "I am not a machine," I screamed back, crawling backward through the mud, edging closer to the terrifying drop of the cliff. "And this baby is not a product for you to throw away." "He is imperfect," Daniel snapped, raising the gun, pointing it squarely at my chest. "If I cannot have perfection, I will have nothing. Come here, Emma. Submit." Now, the alpha command hit me like a physical wave. My omega biology screamed at me to obey, to bow my head and crawl to my mate. My vision tunneled. My muscles twitched, involuntarily trying to move forward. But then I felt a flutter deep in my stomach. It was the very first time I felt my baby move. A surge of pure, primal adrenaline flooded my veins, entirely shattering the biological hold Daniel had over me. I wasn't just a submissive mate, I was a parent, and I would kill before I let him touch my child. My hand frantically searched the mud behind me, my fingers closing around a heavy, jagged piece of Cornish slate. Daniel, arrogant in his belief that his alpha pheromones had subdued me, lowered the gun slightly and reached out to grab my hair. As he leaned in, I lunged forward. With a guttural scream, I drove the jagged slate upward, burying it deep into the soft tissue of Daniel's thigh. Daniel howled, a sound of pure agony and shock. He staggered backward, his hands dropping the gun as he clutched his bleeding leg. His boot slipped on the slick, rain-soaked mud at the very edge of the precipice. For one suspended, terrifying second, our eyes met. I saw the absolute disbelief in his gaze, the realization that his perfect, controlled world was collapsing. Then the earth beneath his heel gave way. Daniel didn't even have time to scream as he tumbled backward, disappearing into the dark abyss. Seconds later, a sickening crack echoed over the sound of the crashing waves, followed by the roaring swallow of the violent sea. I didn't stay to look. I scrambled down the treacherous, hidden smuggler's path, my hands torn and bloody, until I hit the rocky beach below. Through the driving rain, the sweeping beam of a boat searchlight cut through the darkness. "Emma, over here!" A voice shouted from the deck of a small, heavily weathered fishing trawler. I waded into the freezing waist-deep water, strong hands pulling me over the side of the boat. I collapsed onto the wooden deck, gasping for air, clutching my stomach as the boat's engine roared to life, pulling us away from the nightmare. Untrade. 6 months later. The sun was warm against my face as I sat on the porch of a small, secluded cottage in the remote Scottish Highlands. I rocked gently in a wooden chair, looking down at the bundle resting against my chest. Leo was absolutely perfect. He had a shock of dark hair and, when he opened his eyes, they were a bright, piercing blue. He didn't have a heart murmur, but even if he did, I wouldn't have cared. He was mine. The television inside the cottage murmured softly, playing the afternoon news. The anchor's voice drifted through the open window. The ongoing fallout from the Harrington Global scandal. Following the explosive leak of encrypted medical files by an anonymous source, federal authorities have raided the Wellington Clinic and several offshore facilities. Dr. Alistair Reid has pled guilty to illegal genetic tampering and medical malpractice. The search for former CEO Daniel Harrington, who went missing from his Cornish estate 6 months ago, has officially been called off. Authorities presume he was swept out to sea. I reached over and clicked the television off with the remote. I didn't need to hear the rest. The Tyrant was gone, swallowed by the very cliffs he had used to build my cage. I pressed a soft kiss to the top of Leo's head, breathing in the sweet, milky scent of my son. The golden cage was destroyed, and for the first time in my life, the sky was completely mine. The golden cage is finally shattered, Emma's terrifying fight for survival against his billionaire alpha husband proves that a parent's love can conquer even the darkest obsession. If your heart was pounding during that cliffside escape, smash that like button, share this thrilling story with your friends, and subscribe so you never miss another intense drama. Let us know in the comments, did Daniel get exactly what he deserved?